Imagine having a game-changing medical device or combination product idea, but not knowing how to turn it into a safe and effective product that meets all of its requirements. That's where design controls and risk management come in. They are the foundation of bringing your concept to life successfully. Hey, this is Chuck Ventura with Ventura Solutions, your go-to staffing, consulting, and training partner for medical devices and combination products. In this video, we're diving into key considerations during the concept and design input stages, focusing on design controls and risk management. If you're interested in learning more about these topics, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. We've got a lot more content like this coming soon. All right, let's jump in. As far as like the roles and responsibilities and a lot of that information, I like to include somewhat of a RACI matrix that shows for all the various deliverables who's going to be signing them and who's just going to be informed, who's going to be consulted with. So develop a nice RACI chart in this design and development plan. So the design and development plan, it's a required deliverable per FDA design control regulations. And there's elements in ISO 1345 that require planning too. So it's important to start it early on at the beginning of the project. And also keep in mind that this needs to be updated throughout the project periodically. At a minimum, I would update it at least at every design review. So this is a big audit finding a lot of times, that the design and development plan, which is usually the first place an auditor goes to, sees that it's not updated, it hasn't been updated in a while, and usually that could be an audit finding, right? So keep it updated. Like I said, at a minimum, at every design review. We're going to talk briefly about design reviews in a few minutes here, but that's just a few tips on the design and development plan in general. And early on in your project, if everything's not understood, it's okay to leave sections blank, maybe put some information, say, this is to be determined at a certain stage of the product development process. But just as I mentioned, make sure to keep it updated. Keeping it updated will not only satisfy regulatory requirements, but it's also good to keep everybody on the team on the same wavelength, right? Or as we know, various team members come and go. So someone new joins, design and development plan is a good place to go to get a lot of the project information. So design and development plan, also a lot of times referred to as the DDP, is a critical document. It is a regulatory requirement. Like all of these documents in the design control process, they have to follow good documentation practices, revision control, signatures, etc. That's a high-level overview of the design and development plan. I'll just touch briefly on the normal stages of a product development process, so I could kind of relate when these various documents are required. The normal medical device development process is, I should say, the most common is a concept stage, a design input/definition phase, a design output phase, a verification and validation phase, and a design transfer phase, followed by a commercialization/post-market follow-up stage, right? So at a high level, concept stage, you're selecting your design concept. If it's a combo product, even if you're doing off-the-shelf configurations, this is the stage where you're trying to figure out which concept is the best concept, right? And usually at the end of concept stage, you know which concept system architecture you're going with. If it's a combo product, if you're doing off the shelf, you know who you're selecting, which vendor, for example. And then in the design input phase, you're really defining your product, right? So you're finalizing your design inputs, which we're going to talk briefly about in a minute. And then from there, you're going into your design output phase, which is finalizing your design, right? And even if this is something off the shelf, there's still a lot of elements to consider, because you have packaging design, labeling design, graphic art design, IFU, which is part of the design, whether you're doing something off the shelf or not. When you exit design output phase, that's also a lot of milestone referred to as design freeze, right? So especially if you're with a startup, companies use this milestone a lot, design freeze. Of course, it's utilized in industry also, but design freeze is like, hey, we are freezing the design and putting it under configuration management, and we're now going into formal design verification and validation, which essentially is the testing stage. We don't want to make any design changes during the testing stage. If we do, we have to follow a very rigorous change control process, right? And make sure that the change is assessed appropriately, because we may have to go back and redo some testing. But in general, you want to try not to make any design changes during V&V. And after that stage is usually the final design transfer stage. And once the design is transferred to manufacturing, now we can launch the product and do some sort of post-market follow-up to ensure we have a successful launch. The design and development plan is created early on in that concept stage, right? Now, some other documents that you might start drafting or creating in that concept stage would be your user needs. So again, now various companies based on their quality system may call these different names for them, because we're going to talk a little bit right now about user needs and design inputs. Now, the FDA says that we need to create design inputs, right, that define the product requirements, the engineering requirements for the product that need to be measurable, not ambiguous, verifiable. These are going to be our specific requirements for the product, what the product needs to do. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the FDA does say that it also has to address the needs of the user. So the way companies do that in their quality system is create a separate user needs document that captures your high-level customer requirements and then translate those into a separate set of requirements called design inputs. Okay, we're going to touch on both of these shortly here, but for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to align with the FDA's terminology, which is a user need document and a design input document. Various companies based on their quality system could have different names for these. That high-level user needs document could be called a product requirements document, or it could be called some sort of high-level product definition. And then most companies at the design input level will call those design inputs. Some will call them system requirements. Some will call them also product requirements. So different companies based on their quality system will give them different names. For simplicity here, and this is also very common at most companies across industry, user needs, design inputs. So what are these documents? What goes into these documents? The user needs captures all the needs of the users relative to the indication for use. So this is going to capture, if we use an example like a pre-filled syringe system shall be capable of delivering the labeled volume or 1 milliliter of fluid, and it shall be easy for the user to expel the fluid. The cap shall be easy for the user to open. These requirements are a little more subjective or qualitative than a design input, and a little bit subjective, more based on if you were to ask a human, like ask a normal customer or user, what would their needs be, right? They would say something like, well, I want the syringe to be easy to expel the fluid, right? Or I want to be easy to remove the cap. These are user needs, right? Now, some companies will separate that out into separate documents and separate types of requirements that we refer to as stakeholder needs. And these are usually your regulatory requirements. So if there's certain ISO standards that are like consensus standards that you have to comply with, those will go in there, such as like ISO 10991 or various requirements from the ISO standards or from various international regulations. Now, the other type of requirements at this level are internal stakeholder requirements, right? Manufacturing team may have some more requirements, regulatory may have some more requirements, and comprehensively all go into a user needs document or be separated into user needs and stakeholder needs. But it's a high-level set of requirements. For a simple medical device, you might have 20 or 30 of these requirements, and they capture the user needs, the regulatory requirements, such as certain standards that are required to comply with, and the internal stakeholder needs. Those are your high-level requirements. From there, those are going to get translated into very specific design inputs. Right now, this part is very challenging because we have to create a set of design inputs that define what the product needs to do. And you want to be careful. You don't want to create too many of these requirements because you're going to end up over engineering and over testing the product. But you want to create enough to make sure that your product is going to be safe and effective. Right? So design inputs, they need to be specific, measurable, not ambiguous. Right? And there's various types of requirements. There's functional requirements, performance requirements, human factors requirements, reliability requirements, stability, shelf life, labeling, packaging. There's a lot of different types of requirements we have to follow. But if I could try to sum it up as simple as possible with one specific example, let's say you have a user need that says, it shall be easy for the user to remove the cap. That's a high level user need. At the design input level, we need to be specific and measurable. We need to define what does easy mean. And it has to be something that you could verify either by analysis or on the benchtop. You don't want to bring in users at the design input level. So for this user need example, cap shall be easy to remove. We may have a design input that says it shall take less than 4 inch-pounds of torque to remove the cap. The parameter being torque and specific, less than 4 inch-pounds. It's measurable. It's not ambiguous. You don't need users. This is something that could be tested at the benchtop level through design verification that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So design inputs are one of the most important part of the product development process. To give you an idea of timelines, the time we spend on user needs and design inputs should be up to 30% of the whole project timeline, right? And it could be even longer than that. Approximately 20 to 30% of the timeline should be spent creating these requirements. Now, of course, it's not like the project team is sitting around doing nothing else. As you're developing requirements, you're doing a lot of concurrent engineering, right? Maybe you're prototyping parts, you're doing engineering study loops to start testing your product and see its performance. You could be doing human factors formative studies. You could even start aspects of design transfer from a concurrent manufacturing development process with your R&D process. But don't underestimate the time it takes to write good design inputs. This is not something one engineer just goes off in the corner and does right away, right? This is something that you do. Maybe one engineer works on the core requirements, but it takes a lot of various team meetings, cross-functional input to get to that minimally viable set of design inputs for your complete product. This is a topic that I could spend a lot of time talking about. We have a whole online course on design inputs. It's a 3-hour course. I think there's about 7 or 8 chapters. For sure, there's probably over 50 individual 3 to 4 minute lessons. I think it's about 3 hours of content, right? So if you're interested in learning more about design inputs, contact us, let us know, and we could shoot you over a link to that course, because design inputs are very complicated topic. We could spend a lot of time on that. For now, I'm giving you an overview that these are the requirements for what the product has to do, right? For a simple medical device or a basic drug delivery system, you might have 40 to 60 design inputs covering your performance requirements, your functional requirements, human factors related requirements, also your labeling, packaging, conditioning. What is the expiration date? What shipping conditions does it have to survive? Temperature constraints does it have to survive? These types of requirements, along with how much, if it's a drug delivery system, how much volume needs to be delivered, within how much time. If it's an auto injector, the full volume should be delivered within 3 to 4 seconds. What the product should do, not what it does, but what it should do. So that's a nice little overview about user needs and design inputs. Now, I want to pause here as I'm talking about the design control process and also start introducing the risk management process. Because what I'm doing is I'm walking us through the design and development timeline, right? So concept stage, you probably get your design and development plan, finish your, selecting your design concept, collecting user needs. And once you exit concept phase, now you're in the design input phase where you're really finalizing these design input requirements. And concurrently, you should be doing risk management. So even as early as your concept stage, you would do your risk management plan and potentially start on your hazard analysis. And I'm going to talk about both of those briefly here in a minute, but it's important that you start those early, because when you start doing your risk analysis, you have to identify risk controls. Those risk controls are going to be inputs into your design inputs. And this is a requirement also of ISO 13485, where one of the inputs to design input requirements is the output of risk management. So we have to start risk management early on. And this also aligns with normal, like, for example, systems engineering processes, right? So when you get that set of design inputs, it should ensure your product is going to be safe by covering all of the outputs of risk management and having risk controls drive design inputs. It should also make sure your product is effective by ensuring all of the user needs and product claims are integrated into design input requirements. And it should also make sure you're developing a product that's economical and acceptable for your organization. And that's why you'll also have inputs from your stakeholder requirements, which covers inputs at that level from regulatory, quality, manufacturing, R&D organizations within your company. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about that risk management process. Early in the concept stage, you're going to create that risk management plan, which at a minimum is going to cover who the risk management team is, what the scope of the product is that you're going to be doing your risk assessment on. It's also going to include the risk acceptance criteria, right? And usually this is in form of a matrix. You could get quantitative on this if you want. And it looks at, based on the risk profile, acceptable risk you could have in your product. It's ultimately the severity of harm times the probability of the harm. And you'll have a risk acceptability matrix in your risk management plan that you're going to go back to. We also have to define what's the overall risk acceptability criteria, how we're going to approach the and satisfaction of the implementation and effectiveness of risk controls, whether or not we're going to include various FMEAs and at which level we're going to include FMEAs, the scope of our hazard analysis and risk assessment. So all of this is going to get defined in our risk management plan. And then from there, usually early in the concept stage, we'll start what's referred to as a hazard analysis or a system level risk assessment, and they'll be further refined in the design input stage. Now, these are all very complicated topics that we could spend a lot of time talking about. So all we can really do here in this video is just touch on these at a high level. What I'll do is I'll touch on like that system risk assessment is really, you could think of it as a matrix that has various columns, but what we're doing is identifying product hazardous situations, sequence of events that could lead to hazardous situations, and the probability of a hazardous situation occurring. This is usually referred to as P1, and then P2, which is the probability of a hazardous situation leading to a harm. And then for each harm, we could identify a severity on a scale from 1 to 5. And same with probabilities, it's usually a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most probable, 1 being the least probable. And with severities, 5 is usually being the worst case situation, which would be like something like death, and 1 is minimal harm. So all of this is usually identified in a system risk assessment. So we're identifying hazards, we're identifying hazardous situation, looking at various sequence of events and how they could lead to hazardous situations, assessing the risk by looking at P1, P2, and ultimately getting probability of harm, and then multiplying that by the severity and using our risk acceptance criteria to start quantifying various risks associated with our product. And then even early in that design input stage, we start putting in place risk mitigations and risk controls, right? And those risk controls are going to drive design inputs, because the way we're going to implement those risk controls is by creating design inputs. Now, this is a high-level overview of that system risk assessment. Now, what's interesting is this system risk assessment we could start doing once we have a product concept in mind, right? We don't even need a physical product or a prototype. Without even having a prototype, we could do this initial risk assessment. Again, this is a topic we could talk a lot about, but we only have so much time here in this intro video. So that's a high-level overview of a system risk assessment and how it relates to design inputs. So in that design input phase, we should now have a design and development plan, a risk management plan, high-level system risk assessment, or referred to as a hazard analysis, where we start identifying risks and what are the required risk controls, and at the same time, a very solid design input document. And at that point, we could get to actually close out the definition phase of our product development process or design control and risk management process. And from there, we can now enter the design output stage. And the one thing I want to say about the design input stage is if we don't have everything finalized, it's okay to have some TBDs. Like if we don't know exactly what force a product needs to perform at, it's okay. We could put TBDs, but just be, the FDA actually allows this, and they have this in some of their design control guidance documents, but just be aware that as you kick the ball down the road, you're introducing a lot of risk to your project. Because once you go into this more of the design output stage, if you start changing requirements or further defining design inputs, you could have big implications for the design that you put all this effort and resources into. Just something to be aware of as you're trying to exit that design input phase. Okay, so now moving on, we're in the design output phase. In the design output phase, we're iterating on the design, right? And we're creating design outputs. What are design outputs? There's a lot of confusion around this, but in general, design outputs are the engineering drawings and specifications for your final finished product. For example, if you have a pre-filled syringe, use that as a simple example, it would be the exact designs for the glass barrel and the plunger rod and the plunger and the septum and the cap. For every single component on your design, the final design outputs will specify the exact components, suppliers of the components, if you're getting it from suppliers, the exact material grade, the type of materials, the drawings, the final dimensions, the critical dimensions. So the specifications, the drawings for your finished design, right? Including packaging, labeling, graphic art, in the wording that goes on the product and the labeling. So this is all critical for your design outputs. And this is what makes up your design output. So as you're in that design output stage, you're iterating on your design. In parallel, you're doing engineering study loops, is what I like to refer to them as. And you could be doing these engineering study loops even in the design input stage as you're testing prototypes of your design and trying to understand your design input requirements. So it's very important that as you start understanding design inputs and you're evolving your design, you're doing some engineering study loops, which is essentially a pre-design verification. We're going to talk about verification in a second, but that's like your formal testing for your product development project. Engineering study loops, similar analogy to pre-design verification, right? You're understanding your product and going through these testing loops. So come up with a design iteration, write protocols that have your various design inputs, right? Test your product to those various design inputs and see how it's performing. Now, you may not be using the same sample size requirements as formal testing for design verification, but you're getting an idea of whether or not it's going to meet the design inputs. And the higher the sample size is, the better as far as with reliability. You may also want to start looking at various conditioning steps, like what happens if we do accelerated aging, run it through distribution or shipping, drop testing, and see how your product performs. But the design output stage is a very iterative process and will basically go on as long as it takes to get to your final design. And it could go on quite long depending on how complex the technical challenge. Going to risk management, on the risk management side, this is the stage where a lot of companies introduce FMEAs. So there's a design FMEA and process FMEAs. But I'm going to focus a little more on the design FMEA, where now that we have an idea of what the design is looking like, we are starting by allocating components of the design to functional requirements and analyzing failure modes and looking at the causes, trying to rank and stack the effect of those causes by looking at the risk to the patient or even the risk to the system function. And then we start putting mitigations in place. And those mitigations could be similar to risk controls, like that translate to design inputs. They could also translate to very specific design outputs, such as critical features on a drawing. It's very important to go through that DFMEA during the design output stage, because the outputs of the DFMEA are going to do two things. They're going to trace up to our system risk assessment or our hazard analysis and drive that risk assessment further and ensure we have all the right design inputs in place for our finished design. But at the DFMEA level, they can also drive specific design output. Hey, I hope you found this video helpful as we explored key considerations during the concept and design input stages. If you're interested in diving deeper into other stages like design outputs, verification, validation, and more, be sure to hit the subscribe button below. We got plenty of great content on the way. And if you ever need any consulting, staffing, or training support related to any of these topics, please reach out. My team and I will be happy to help. See you next time.